In the 1940s, the Nazis marched victoriously across Europe and sank their fangs into the Soviet Union. But the Soviet people proved stronger than the Nazis' fangs. The Germans were bogged down in the Kuban region, where they were being attacked from all sides. The command was in despair, and only Corporal Rolf Steiner remained undefeated. He was an experienced soldier and had carried out very difficult missions, for which he was held in high regard. His commanders turned a blind eye to some of his antics. While the officers hid in fortifications under fire from Soviet soldiers, Steiner and his team went to neutralize a mortar position. They killed everyone inside. Only a boy survived, and he was captured. At that moment, Captain Stransky arrived at headquarters. He had voluntarily transferred from France to the Kuban region to command Steiner's battalion. The regiment commander, Colonel Brandt, is perplexed why an officer like Stransky would risk a transfer from the relative safety of Europe to the east. The captain admits he wants to receive the Iron Cross as a reward. As he leaves the fortification, a mortar barrage begins, and Stransky realizes that his name can now be pronounced without the letter T. However, he quickly gathers his courage and, seeing Steiner returning, orders him to kill the captured boy. "You know as well as I do that there were orders not to take prisoners." The corporal refuses. Then Stransky decides to do it himself. One of Steiner's men says he'll take care of the boy. The prisoner is hidden in a bunker, fed, and allowed to live with Steiner's soldiers. The corporal himself trusts the boy. He even leaves his weapon unattended near him. After resting, he goes to Stransky with a report on his sortie. The captain announces that he has promoted Steiner to sergeant. However, this doesn't impress him in the least. Realizing that Steiner isn't ready to submit to him, Stransky tries to bend him. But even here he encounters serious resistance. He dismisses the sergeant and decides to keep an eye on him. One of the soldiers in Steiner's battalion is celebrating his birthday. The soldiers begin to celebrate, but not everyone enjoys the merriment. The seasoned soldier suffers a nervous breakdown and has to be calmed down. Meanwhile, Captain Stransky notices a couple in his entourage who enjoy touching each other's bodies. His adjutant and Lieutenant Triebek are developing a tender relationship. Stransky decides to expose them. He, too, pretends to be an unconventional captain and forces the lieutenant to confess to his own addiction. Afterward, he promises to hang both of them if he catches them in debauchery even once. Steiner realizes that the Russians will soon launch an offensive and the captured boy will be in trouble. So he takes him behind German lines and sends him back to his own people. As the prisoner leaves, the enemy appears out of the fog. The soldiers open fire and kill the boy. The attack begins, and the Nazis get a good beating. Steiner and his men miraculously escape unharmed. They fight tirelessly, while Captain Stransky hides out in his bunker under the table. He's panicking. He's afraid the enemy will finish him off, and while Stransky cowardly hid in the shelter, Steiner suffered a concussion and ended up in the hospital. There, he began hallucinating. Once, he even escaped and climbed into a pond. A nurse had to wade in to pull him out. One day, high-ranking officials came to the hospital to examine the wounded and issue orders. They ordered the doctors to treat a certain percentage of the soldiers so they could be returned to the front as quickly as possible. The commanders also ordered that the wounded be well fed. Seeing the treats on the table, the soldiers pounced on them like animals and began stuffing their bellies. Only Steiner didn't join in this feast. He took a bottle of wine and wandered away from the others. A nurse joined him. Soon, they began a relationship. When Steiner was almost fully recovered, he met one of his own in the hospital. He was getting ready to return to the front, to Russia. Hearing this, Steiner quickly packed his things and went with him. Seeing him packing, the nurse realized that the war was more important to this man than herself and everything else. "Do you really love war that much?" Quote, when Steiner returned to the front, his old friends and comrades greeted him joyfully. They had suffered greatly at the hands of the Soviet army, and their mood was despondent, but the sergeant's return gave them hope. Upon learning of Steiner's arrival, Captain Stransky summoned him. He ordered a document signed confirming that Stransky was on the battlefield during the bloodbath that concussed Steiner. Lieutenant Triebek had already signed this document. However, the sergeant refuses to sign it. He didn't see the captain in action and isn't prepared to claim otherwise, even for the sake of Stransky receiving the Iron Cross. While the captain and the sergeant were talking, an air raid occurred. Realizing the planes were bombing his platoon's positions, Steiner rushed to his own side. After this, Colonel Brand summons Steiner. He asks him to honestly state whether Sergeant Stransky saw him on the battlefield that day. Brand wants to punish the captain for his lie, but Steiner isn't prepared to ruin this officer's career. Then Brand summons Trebek. He claims that Stransky commanded the counterattack, but the soldiers questioned unanimously say otherwise. Therefore, Brand decides to file a complaint with a military court. However, in this case, Steiner must testify. The sergeant wasn't ready to give his consent right away. Meanwhile, Stransky was convinced the Nazis would soon take Crimea, but Brandt was informed that the Germans would have to retreat. Soviet soldiers had routed them. When Brandt was informed of this, he was ready to leave at any moment. He was ordered to immediately evacuate all rearguard platoons. However, Captain Kiesel contacted him and told him to wait for Steiner's platoon first. However, Stransky disobeyed the order. He decided to bury Steiner and his soldiers there and left without them. When the Russians attacked, Steiner's platoon had a difficult time. They abandoned their positions under pressure from tanks and infantry. The decision was made to escape through an abandoned factory. There, Soviet soldiers pinned them down, and their escape was botched. Despite this, Steiner and his men managed to break out of the encirclement. Brandt understood that things were difficult for the sergeant, if he was even alive, and he no longer thought he would see Steiner again. But he proved resilient. He and his men were stationed in the rear. Reaching the river, Steiner and his men spotted a bridge and Russian soldiers on it. They crept up on the guards and slaughtered them. Crossing to the other bank, they came upon a small outpost with a detachment of female soldiers. The Germans managed to capture them without a fight. The Nazis only required uniforms from the women. They wanted to change and pass through the Russian lines to their own. However, the sight of women, whom the Nazis hadn't seen for a long time, led some soldiers to succumb to temptation. The Russians took advantage of this. One of the soldiers hinted to a German that she wouldn't mind having some fun with him, and when he took her to a barn, she bit off his pod at the root. At that moment, her friend stabbed a young soldier to death, who thought he could get his share. Sergeant Steiner was outside. Hearing the soldier's pitiful cry, he entered and saw him dying. Screams were then heard from the barn. Steiner didn't punish the women. Instead, he let them deal with the podless soldier in their own way. Now we're even. Leaving him to be devoured by the Russians, Steiner led the rest back to his own side. The plan was simple, as reliable as a Bavarian watch. Some of the soldiers would disguise themselves in Soviet uniforms and pass through the Russian lines. Steiner would then send a coded message to the Germans, announcing that he was bringing prisoners. This would allow them to return. Meanwhile, Brandt contacted his command and arranged for Kiesel to be transferred to the rear. Captain Kiesel was exhausted by the war. He was in deep despair, and Brandt decided to take care of him in this way. Kiesel tried to protest, but eventually left the front. Meanwhile, the disguised Germans brought Steiner, hands raised, to the Soviet soldiers and, in broken Russian, explained that they were prisoners. They refused to take prisoners, and when the Germans tried to pass by, they were discovered and attempted to shoot. However, Steiner's men were prepared for this outcome. They shot the Soviet soldiers and reached the radio station. Steiner ordered a password to be devised for passing through the German lines. He also asked that they be informed that he was bringing Russian prisoners. This was necessary to avoid being shot as they approached, since some of his soldiers were dressed in Soviet uniforms. Captain Stransky received Steiner's message. He had no intention of allowing the sergeant near his positions and ordered that everyone be killed. Trebek agreed, because his friendship with Stransky promised him a transfer to the rear. When Steiner brought his men to no man's land, he ordered them to surrender their weapons. Those in Soviet uniforms were to be unarmed, otherwise they risked being killed. He then led the soldiers forward, but they opened fire. Trebek commanded the firing. Steiner managed to break through, finally realizing that the man in front of them was a sergeant. The machine gunner had ceased firing. Steiner was allowed into the trench, where he took aim at Lieutenant Trebek. He immediately surrendered to Stransky, saying he was simply following orders. Quote, "I have nothing to do with this." Quote, however, this admission wasn't enough for Steiner. His men had died at the hands of their own soldiers, and Trebek would regret it. The sergeant shot him on the spot and then went after Stransky. The Russians were advancing. Colonel Brand contacted Stransky and ordered him to bring his men to his aid. But the captain refused to move toward him. He wasn't in the best position himself. Meanwhile, Steiner crossed the battlefield and finally reached Stransky. However, he didn't kill him. Instead, he offered to earn the Iron Cross in battle. When Steiner turned away, the captain was tempted to shoot him in the back, but Stransky decided against it. He finally grabbed his tiny bells and walked out onto the battlefield. Seeing him shaking, Captain Steiner started laughing, and gradually his cheerful laughter grew more and more insane. And then the Soviet soldiers tore their asses apart.